The morning mist clung to the forest floor like a ghostly blanket as Sarah Martinez clipped the leash onto her German shepherd, Rex. At 16, Sarah had made this walk through the wooded trails behind her family's ranch countless times. But today something felt different. Rex's ears perked up more than usual, his nose twitching at scents carried on the cool October breeze. Sarah's family had moved to this remote area of Montana 3 years ago when her father retired from the military. The nearest neighbor lived 5 miles away, and the closest town was a 40-minute drive through winding mountain roads. Her parents often worried about her walking alone, but Rex had proven himself a loyal protector more than once, scaring off bears and warning them about strangers approaching their property. As they ventured deeper into the forest, following a narrow deer trail that wound between towering pine trees, Rex suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His body went rigid, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Sarah had learned to trust her dog's instincts completely. Rex had never been wrong about danger. "What is it, boy?" Sarah whispered, her hand instinctively tightening on the leash. The forest around them seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered from the branches above. Even the usual rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush had ceased. Rex began pulling toward a dense thicket of bushes about 50 yards off the main trail. Sarah hesitated. Her parents had always told her to stick to the marked paths, especially when she was alone. But Rex's behavior was so unusual, so insistent, that she found herself following him through the brambles and low-hanging branches. The first thing she noticed was the smell. It wasn't the clean, earthy scent she was accustomed to in these woods. This was something else entirely, something that made her stomach turn. Rex whined softly, his tail tucked between his legs as he led her toward a small clearing she had never seen before. What Sarah discovered there would haunt her dreams for months to come, but it would also set in motion a chain of events that would restore faith in an institution that had been shaken to its core. 2 men lay motionless on the forest floor, their bodies partially hidden beneath a pile of fallen branches and leaves. At first glance, Sarah thought they might be hunters who had suffered some kind of accident. But as she moved closer, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, she noticed things that didn't make sense. Both men wore dark suits, now torn and dirty from their ordeal. One man appeared to be in his 40s with graying hair and a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. The other was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, with the kind of build that suggested regular physical training. Neither man carried hunting rifles or wore the bright orange safety gear that Montana law required during hunting season. More disturbing still were the zip ties that bound their wrists behind their backs and the duct tape that had been wrapped around their ankles. Someone had deliberately left these men here to die. Sarah's first instinct was to run. Every horror movie she had ever watched, every true crime documentary her mother obsessed over, told her to get as far away as possible and call the police. But as she stood there, frozen with terror and indecision, one of the men stirred. The older man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and filled with pain. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper emerged from his cracked lips. Sarah couldn't make out the words, but the desperation in his voice was unmistakable. He was begging for help. Rex, who had been hanging back nervously, suddenly stepped forward and began licking the man's face. The dog's gentle nature overcame his fear, and Sarah realized that if Rex trusted these men enough to approach them, they probably weren't dangerous. "It's okay," Sarah said softly, though her voice shook with emotion. "I'm going to help you." She knelt beside the older man and carefully peeled away the duct tape from his mouth. He gasped, drawing in deep, ragged breaths as if he had been drowning and had finally reached the surface. "Water," he managed to croak. "Please, water." Sarah always carried a water bottle on her walks, and she quickly unscrewed the cap and held it to his lips. He drank greedily, some of the liquid spilling down his chin as his bound hands prevented him from controlling the flow. "Who did this to you?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's eyes focused on her face for the first time, and she saw a mixture of relief and something else, something that looked almost like shame. "FBI," he whispered. "We're FBI agents. Our own people, they left us here to die." Sarah's blood ran cold. She had heard enough news reports to know that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was supposed to be one of the most respected law enforcement agencies in the country. The idea that FBI agents would abandon their own colleagues seemed impossible, like something out of a conspiracy theory movie. But as she looked at the second man, who was beginning to stir as well, she noticed something that confirmed the first agent's story. Partially visible beneath his torn jacket was a shoulder holster, and clipped to his belt was what looked like an official badge. "My partner," the older agent said, struggling to sit up despite his restraints. "Is he alive?" Sarah moved to the younger man and checked for a pulse. It was weak but steady. "He's alive," she said, "but he needs medical attention." "You both do." "You have to listen to me," the older agent said urgently. "My name is Special Agent David Morrison. This is Agent Jake Rodriguez. We were investigating corruption within our own bureau when our backup team turned on us. They brought us out here 3 days ago and left us to die because we discovered something we weren't supposed to see." Sarah's mind raced. 3 days. These men had been lying here, bound and helpless, for 3 days. The fact that they were still alive was nothing short of miraculous. But they wouldn't survive much longer without proper medical care and nourishment. "I need to call for help," Sarah said, reaching for her cell phone. But when she looked at the screen, her heart sank. No signal. The thick forest canopy and the remote location made communication impossible. "No," Agent Morrison said weakly. "You can't call the local police. We don't know who we can trust. The corruption goes deeper than you can imagine. If word gets out that we're still alive before we can get to the right people, they'll come back to finish the job." Sarah stared at him, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had stumbled into. Here she was, a 16-year-old girl with no experience beyond small-town life, suddenly responsible for the lives of 2 federal agents and potentially holding the key to exposing corruption at the highest levels of government. Rex whined softly beside her. As if sensing the weight of the moment, Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. Sarah's hands trembled as she used the multi-tool from her backpack to cut through the zip ties binding Agent Morrison's wrists. The plastic had cut deep into his skin, leaving angry red marks that spoke of his desperate attempts to free himself over the past 3 days. When his hands came free, he immediately began working to restore circulation, wincing as blood flow returned to his fingers. "We need to move carefully," Morrison whispered, his voice growing stronger with each sip of water Sarah provided. "If they have people watching the area, any sudden activity could bring them back." Sarah helped him work on freeing Agent Rodriguez, who was slowly regaining consciousness. The younger agent's condition was more concerning. His breathing was shallow, and a large bruise on the side of his head suggested he had suffered a significant blow during their capture. "Jake," Morrison said softly, gently shaking his partner's shoulder. "Jake, can you hear me?" Rodriguez's eyes opened slowly, unfocused and filled with confusion. "David?" he mumbled. "Where are we? What happened to the meeting?" "We're in the forest where they left us," Morrison explained patiently. "This young lady found us. She's going to help us get out of here." As Sarah cut through Rodriguez's restraints, she listened while Morrison explained their situation in hushed tones. The 2 agents had been investigating a money laundering operation that involved several high-ranking FBI officials. They had arranged to meet with a confidential informant who claimed to have evidence of the corruption, but the meeting had been a trap. "Our own tactical team picked us up from the field office," Morrison said, his voice filled with bitterness. "Men we had worked with for years, men we trusted with our lives. They drugged us in the vehicle and brought us here with orders to make our disappearance look like we had gone rogue and fled the country." The scope of the betrayal was staggering. These weren't just corrupt individuals acting alone, but a coordinated effort involving multiple departments. Within the FBI, Sarah struggled to comprehend how an organization dedicated to upholding the law could harbor such widespread corruption. "How do you know I can trust you?" Sarah asked the question, surprising even herself. But she realized that if the corruption was as widespread as Morrison claimed, she needed to be certain these men were truly the victims they appeared to be. Morrison managed a weak smile. "Smart girl," he said. "You shouldn't trust anyone blindly, especially in a situation like this." He reached into his jacket pocket with shaking hands and pulled out a leather wallet. Inside was his official FBI identification, complete with photograph and badge number. "More importantly," he continued, "check my partner's pocket. He carries a letter from his daughter. Read it." Sarah found the letter in Rodriguez's jacket. The paper was worn soft from repeated handling, and the childish handwriting was unmistakably genuine. It was a Father's Day card from a 7-year-old girl named Maria, telling her daddy how proud she was that he caught the bad guys and kept people safe. No one planning to betray their country would carry such a personal reminder of their duty to protect innocent people. Sarah's last doubts dissolved. "What do we do now?" she asked. "I can carry one of you, but you're both too weak to walk very far, and it's 3 miles back to my house." "You can't take us to your house," Morrison said firmly. "If they're monitoring communications or tracking our movements, you'd be putting your family in danger. We need to find another way." Sarah thought carefully about their options. The nearest hospital was 30 miles away in the town of Glacier Falls, but getting there would require driving past several areas where they could easily be spotted or intercepted. Her father's military training had taught her family about strategic thinking, and she tried to apply those lessons now. "There's an old hunting cabin about 2 miles from here," she said finally. "My family used it last winter when we got snowed in during a storm. It has a generator, some basic medical supplies, and canned food. More importantly, it's hidden and no one knows we use it." Morrison nodded approvingly. "That could work. We need time to recover our strength and figure out who we can trust to contact. But getting there is going to be the challenge." Sarah studied both men carefully. Rodriguez was in worse shape, barely able to sit up on his own. Morrison was weak but mobile. With Rex's help, she might be able to get them to the cabin, but it would require multiple trips and careful planning. "I'm going to take Agent Rodriguez first," she decided. "Rex can help support him, and I can use some branches to make a makeshift stretcher for the worst parts of the terrain. Then I'll come back for you, Agent Morrison." "Absolutely not," Morrison said firmly. "You're not splitting us up. If something happens to you while you're helping Jake, I'll be stranded here. And if someone finds me alone, I won't be able to protect myself in this condition." Sarah saw the wisdom in his argument, but she also knew that trying to move both men at once would be nearly impossible. That's when Rex surprised them all by demonstrating his intelligence, in a way that would prove crucial to their survival. The German Shepherd had been listening to their conversation, with the kind of focused attention that suggested he understood more than anyone realized. Suddenly, he trotted over to a fallen log near the edge of the clearing and began barking softly while looking back at Sarah. "What's he doing?" Rodriguez asked, his voice still weak but clearer than before. Sarah followed Rex to the log and immediately saw what he was showing her. The fallen tree was the perfect size and shape to serve as a travois, the kind of emergency transport her father had taught her to make during wilderness survival training. "You're a genius." "Boy," she whispered, scratching Rex behind the ears. Working quickly, Sarah used paracord from her emergency kit to lash smaller branches to the log, creating a crude but functional stretcher. She tested it by dragging it around the clearing, and while it wasn't perfect, it would allow her to transport both agents together. The journey to the cabin took nearly 2 hours. Sarah pulled the makeshift stretcher while Rex helped guide them through the safest route, often ranging ahead to check for obstacles or threats. Both agents took turns walking when the terrain allowed, but their weakened condition meant they needed frequent rest stops. During one of these breaks, Morrison shared more details about their investigation. The money laundering operation involved drug cartels, terrorist organizations, and corrupt government officials at multiple levels. The amounts of money involved were staggering, enough to compromise dozens of federal agents and officials. "The evidence we gathered could bring down half the senior leadership at our field office," Morrison explained. "But it's hidden in a safety deposit box that only Jake and I can access together. That's why they couldn't just kill us immediately. They needed to make us disappear in a way that would give them time to cover their tracks." As they finally reached the hunting cabin, Sarah realized that saving these 2 men was only the beginning. Now they had to figure out how to expose the corruption without getting themselves killed in the process. The cabin was exactly as Sarah remembered it, small but well-equipped for wilderness survival. She helped both agents inside and immediately began assessing their medical needs while Rex stood guard at the door, his ears alert for any sounds of approaching danger. Night was falling, and somewhere in the darkness, corrupt federal agents were probably wondering why their victims hadn't died as planned. The real work of restoring the FBI's honor was just beginning. The hunting cabin felt like a fortress against the outside world, as Sarah worked by lamplight to tend to the agent's injuries. The first aid kit her father had stocked contained antibiotics, bandages, and pain medication that would help both men regain their strength. Agent Rodriguez's head injury was her primary concern. as he showed signs of a concussion that could worsen without proper monitoring. "Tell me about the headaches," Sarah said, checking Rodriguez's pupils with a small flashlight. Her father's military medical training had rubbed off on her during years of camping and outdoor adventures, where injuries were common. "Constant," Rodriguez admitted, wincing as the light hit his eyes. "And I keep seeing double when I try to focus on things up close." Morrison watched anxiously from the cabin's single bed, where Sarah had insisted he rest. "He took a bad hit with a metal baton when we tried to fight back during the ambush," he explained. "They wanted us conscious but helpless." As Sarah cleaned and bandaged their wounds, the agents began sharing the full scope of what they had discovered. The corruption wasn't limited to a few bad actors, but represented a systematic betrayal of everything the FBI was supposed to stand for. It started 18 months ago when we noticed unusual patterns in several high-profile cases, Morrison began. Drug busts where the evidence mysteriously disappeared, financial investigations that were suddenly closed without explanation, witness protection cases where people simply vanished. Rodriguez, despite his condition, picked up the narrative. "We thought it was just bureaucratic incompetence at first, but when we started connecting the dots, we realized that someone was actively sabotaging investigations that threatened certain criminal organizations." The story they told was one of gradual corruption that had spread like cancer through their field office. It began with a few agents accepting small bribes to look the other way on minor infractions. But as the criminal organizations grew bolder and more generous with their payments, the corruption spread to supervisors, evidence technicians, and even senior administrators. "The breaking point came when we discovered that our assistant director was personally involved," Morrison said, his voice filled with disgust. "Martin Kellerman, a man I had respected for 15 years, was not only taking bribes but actively recruiting other agents into the network." Sarah listened in horror as they described how Kellerman had used his position to identify honest agents who posed a threat to the operation. Some were transferred to distant field offices. Others found their careers destroyed by false allegations of misconduct. A few, like Morrison and Rodriguez, were marked for elimination. "We spent months building a case," Rodriguez continued, pressing a cold compress to his forehead. "Bank records, recorded conversations, photographic evidence of meetings between FBI personnel and known criminals. We had enough evidence to clean house completely. But their investigation had been discovered before they could act on it. The same surveillance techniques they used against criminals had been turned against them by their own colleagues. Every move they made, every contact they developed, was being monitored by the very people they were investigating. The irony is crushing," Morrison said bitterly. "We used FBI resources to investigate FBI corruption, which made it easy for them to track our progress and stay one step ahead. The final trap had been expertly laid. Kellerman himself had approached them with what appeared to be a breakthrough in the case, claiming that a high-level informant was ready to provide evidence that would expose the entire network. The meeting was set for a remote location, where the informant supposedly felt safe from retaliation. Everything about it felt wrong," Rodriguez admitted, "but we thought we were being paranoid. We trusted our tactical support team completely. These were men who had saved our lives in dangerous situations before. Instead, the tactical team had been compromised months earlier. They drugged both agents during the drive to the supposed meeting and brought them to the forest where Sarah eventually found them. The plan was simple but effective: make them disappear in a way that would suggest they had fled the country with stolen evidence. Kellerman was planning to announce that we had gone rogue," Morrison explained. "He would claim that we had been the ones selling information to criminals and that we had stolen classified files before fleeing to avoid prosecution. It would have destroyed our reputations and made any evidence we had gathered inadmissible in court." Sarah realized the brilliant cruelty of the plan. By framing Morrison and Rodriguez as the corrupt agents, Kellerman would not only eliminate the threat they posed but also provide a convenient explanation for any evidence of corruption that might surface later. Any accusations could be dismissed as the desperate lies of disgraced former agents. But now that Sarah had found them alive, everything had changed. The evidence was still hidden in their safety deposit box, accessible only with both agents present. More importantly, they were witnesses to their own attempted murder, able to testify about the scope of the corruption they had uncovered. Where exactly is this safety deposit box? Sarah asked, beginning to formulate a plan of her own. First National Bank in Denver, Morrison replied. Box 247. But getting there is going to be nearly impossible. Kellerman will have people watching all transportation hubs, and our photos have probably been distributed to law enforcement agencies across the region as fugitive alerts. Sarah studied both men carefully. Even with rest and medical attention, they would need several days to recover enough strength for a long journey. But time was not on their side. Every hour they delayed gave Kellerman more opportunity to cover his tracks and eliminate any remaining evidence of his crimes. We need to contact someone in law enforcement who isn't compromised, Sarah said. Someone with enough authority to protect you and act on your evidence. That's the problem, Rodriguez said weakly. We don't know how far the corruption extends. It could involve people at the state level, or even other federal agencies. Kellerman has had 18 months to build relationships and spread his influence. The weight of the situation settled over the cabin like a suffocating blanket. 3 people and a dog, hidden in a remote cabin, holding evidence that could expose one of the largest corruption scandals in FBI history. But they were surrounded by enemies and had no way to know who they could trust. That's when Sarah remembered something her father had taught her about military operations. When facing an enemy with superior resources and unknown capabilities, the key was to change the rules of engagement entirely. What if we don't try to work within the system? She suggested. What if we go around it completely? Morrison looked at her with interest. What do you mean? My father always said that the best way to defeat a corrupt system is to expose it to the light. What if instead of trying to find one honest federal agent among dozens of potentially corrupt ones, we go directly to the public? The idea was radical but potentially brilliant. Rather than trying to navigate the complex web of federal law enforcement, they could take their evidence directly to journalists and public interest groups who specialized in exposing government corruption. It's risky, Rodriguez said thoughtfully. If we go public before we can get official protection, Kellerman's people might try to silence us permanently. They're already trying to kill you, Sarah pointed out. At least this way, if something happens to you, the truth will still come out. As they discussed the possibilities, Rex suddenly stood up from his position by the door. His ears perked and a low growl rumbling in his chest. Someone was approaching the cabin through the darkness. Sarah quickly extinguished the lamp, plunging them into complete darkness. Through the cabin's small window, she could see the beam of a flashlight moving through the trees. Someone had found them. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the flashlight beam sweep back and forth outside the cabin window. Rex remained perfectly still beside her, his body tense and ready to spring into action. Both agents had gone completely silent, their breathing barely audible in the darkness. The beam stopped moving and focused directly on the cabin door. Sarah could hear footsteps now, careful and deliberate, the sound of someone trying to move quietly through the forest undergrowth. Whoever was out there knew exactly where they were. Morrison slowly reached for his service weapon, only to remember that it had been taken during their capture. They were completely defenseless except for Sarah's small camping knife and whatever improvised weapons they could find in the cabin. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Sarah held her breath, waiting for the inevitable moment when their pursuer would try to force entry. But instead of breaking down the door, they heard a voice, quiet but urgent. Sarah? Sarah Martinez? If you're in there, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The voice was unfamiliar, belonging to neither of the agents who had captured Morrison and Rodriguez. It was a woman's voice, middle-aged and carrying the kind of authority that suggested law enforcement training. My name is Deputy Director Catherine Walsh from FBI headquarters in Washington. The voice continued. I know you found Agents Morrison and Rodriguez. I'm here to help them, but we don't have much time. Morrison's eyes widened in the darkness. Sarah could see his lips forming the words Deputy Director Walsh silently. He seemed to recognize the name, but she couldn't tell if that was a good thing or bad thing. How do we know you're really who you say you are? Sarah called out, her voice stronger than she felt. How do we know you're not one of the corrupt agents? Because if I were working with Kellerman, this cabin would already be surrounded by a tactical team, Walsh replied. And because I can tell you something that only Agent Morrison would know. David, do you remember the conversation we had about your daughter's college applications 3 months ago? You were worried about the tuition costs at Georgetown University. Morrison's posture relaxed slightly. It was clearly information that only someone who knew him personally would possess. But Sarah remained skeptical. In a corruption scandal, this widespread personal relationships could be just as compromised as professional ones. That could be information you tortured out of someone, Sarah pointed out. We need better proof. There was a pause, then Walsh spoke again, this time with what sounded like grudging respect. You're absolutely right to be cautious. Agent Rodriguez, I know you keep a photo of your daughter Maria in your wallet. She's wearing a purple dress with white flowers and she's missing her 2 front teeth in the picture. On the back of the photo, you wrote, Daddy's Angel, forever and always. Rodriguez sucked in a sharp breath. Only my partner knows about that inscription, he whispered to Morrison. I've never shown it to anyone else at the Bureau. Which means either she's legitimate, Morrison whispered back, or they've been monitoring us far more closely than we realized. Sarah made a command decision.
Keeping her knife ready in one hand, she slowly opened the cabin door just enough to see outside.
The woman standing in the small clearing wore a dark windbreaker and hiking boots. Her gray hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and despite the late hour, she looked alert and professional. More importantly, she was alone. If this were a trap, Sarah would have expected to see other agents positioned around the cabin. You can come in, Sarah said, opening the door wider, but keep your hands where I can see them. Walsh stepped into the cabin and immediately pulled out a small LED light, keeping it pointed toward the floor to avoid destroying their night vision. In the dim glow, Sarah could see that she was exactly what she appeared to be, a senior law enforcement official who looked like she had been through several very stressful days. Agent Morrison, Agent Rodriguez, Walsh said, her voice filled with relief. When you missed your scheduled check-in 4 days ago, I knew something had gone wrong. You knew about our investigation? Morrison asked, struggling to sit up straighter. I've been running a parallel investigation from Washington for the past 6 months, Walsh explained. When corruption allegations started reaching my office, I realized we needed to investigate the investigators. Your field office wasn't the only one with problems. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The corruption wasn't limited to one field office or even one region. It was a nationwide problem that had infected multiple levels of the FBI's organization. How bad is it? Rodriguez asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. 12 field offices compromised to some degree, Walsh said grimly. Over 60 agents involved in various levels of corruption, and Assistant Director Kellerman isn't even the biggest fish in this pond, Walsh explained that her investigation had started when several major criminal organizations seemed to be staying one step ahead of federal investigations with suspicious consistency. Financial crimes that should have resulted in major prosecutions were mysteriously dropped. Drug trafficking networks that should have been dismantled continued operating with impunity. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence, Walsh continued. Someone with high-level access was feeding information to criminals and actively sabotaging investigations. But every time we got close to identifying the source, evidence would disappear or witnesses would recant their statements. Sarah listened as Walsh described a cat-and-mouse game that had been going on for months. Honest agents trying to investigate corruption, while corrupt agents worked to cover their tracks and eliminate threats. Morrison and Rodriguez had gotten closer to the truth than anyone else, which made them priority targets for elimination. How did you find us? Morrison asked. I've been tracking Kellerman's movement since you disappeared, Walsh explained. When his people made multiple trips to this area over the past 3 days, I knew this was where they had taken you. I've been searching the forest systematically, looking for any sign of what happened. What's our next move? Sarah asked, surprising herself by including herself in the planning process. But she realized that she was now as much a part of this conspiracy as the agents were. She had seen too much and knew too much to simply walk away. We need to get you both to a safe location where you can recover and testify, Walsh said. But more importantly, we need to retrieve that evidence from your safety deposit box before Kellerman realizes you're still alive. That's easier said than done, Rodriguez pointed out. Denver is 800 miles from here, and Kellerman will have people watching every transportation hub between here and there. Walsh smiled for the first time since entering the cabin. That's where having federal resources that aren't compromised comes in handy. I have a helicopter waiting 20 miles from here, and a team of agents from the Washington office who I personally vetted before bringing them west. The plan was ambitious but feasible. They would move to the helicopter under cover of darkness, fly directly to Denver to retrieve the evidence, and then proceed to a secure federal facility where Morrison and Rodriguez could provide their testimony in safety. But as they prepared to leave the cabin, Sarah realized that her role in this operation was far from over. Walsh made it clear that Sarah's testimony about finding the agents and their condition would be crucial in proving that Kellerman had attempted to murder federal officers. "I'm sorry to drag you into this," Walsh said to Sarah as they gathered their minimal belongings, "but your courage in saving these men may have saved the integrity of the entire FBI. We won't forget that." As they prepared to venture back into the dangerous forest, Sarah felt a mixture of fear and pride. She had started the day as an ordinary teenager taking her dog for a walk. Now she was a key witness in one of the largest corruption cases in federal law enforcement history. Rex seemed to sense the importance of the moment. He positioned himself at the front of their small group, ready to lead them through the darkness toward whatever awaited them next. The helicopter ride to Denver was Sarah's first time flying in anything smaller than a commercial airliner, and under different circumstances, she might have enjoyed the experience. The aircraft was a sleek federal law enforcement model, equipped with advanced navigation systems and communication equipment that kept them in constant contact with Walsh's team in Washington. Agent Rodriguez's condition had stabilized during the flight, though he still showed signs of concussion. Morrison was stronger, able to walk without assistance and think clearly about the challenges that lay ahead. Both men had used the travel time to brief Walsh on every detail of their investigation, ensuring that if anything happened to them, the deputy director would have enough information to continue their work. Sarah found herself fascinated by the complexity of the corruption network they were working to expose. It wasn't simply a matter of a few bad agents taking bribes. The criminal organizations had systematically identified key personnel throughout the FBI structure and carefully recruited them over a period of years. They started with people who had financial problems, Morrison explained as they flew through the pre-dawn darkness. Agents going through expensive divorces, people with gambling debts, anyone who might be vulnerable to financial pressure. Once they had someone compromised, they used that person to identify other potential recruits. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than trying to corrupt entire departments at once, the criminals had focused on building a network of individuals who could provide information and interference when needed. A corrupt evidence technician here, a compromised supervisor there, a few administrative personnel who could make files disappear. The scariest part, Rodriguez added, is how they compartmentalize the operation. Most of the corrupt agents probably don't even know who else is involved. They just receive instructions through intermediaries and carry out specific tasks without seeing the bigger picture. As they approached Denver, Walsh coordinated with her security team to ensure that their arrival would go unnoticed. The helicopter landed at a private airfield outside the city, where 3 black SUVs waited with agents from the Washington office. "Are you certain we can trust these people?" Morrison asked as they transferred to the vehicles. "I personally recruited each of these agents for this operation," Walsh replied firmly. "They're all from outside the regions where we've identified corruption, and I've had them under direct supervision for the past month. If I can't trust them, then the entire FBI is compromised beyond saving." The drive to downtown Denver took 40 minutes through early morning traffic. Sarah watched the city wake up around them, ordinary people heading to work and going about their daily lives, completely unaware that the integrity of federal law enforcement hung in the balance of what happened in the next few hours. First National Bank opened at 9 o'clock sharp, and Walsh's team had positioned themselves strategically around the building to watch for any signs of surveillance or interference. Morrison and Rodriguez walked into the bank together, both nervous about whether Kellerman's people might have somehow discovered the location of their evidence. Sarah waited in one of the SUVs with Walsh, watching the bank entrance and listening to radio communications between the various team members. The tension was almost unbearable as minutes ticked by without any word from the agents inside. "How long should this take?" Sarah asked, her hands fidgeting with Rex's leash. "Not long," Walsh replied, though her voice carried an undertone of worry. "Access to the safety deposit box should be straightforward, but if there are complications..." Her voice trailed off, leaving the implications unspoken. If Kellerman had somehow anticipated this move, Morrison and Rodriguez could be walking into another trap. But this time, Walsh's team was prepared for trouble. 20 minutes later, both agents emerged from the bank carrying a large metal document box between them. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her as she watched them walk calmly to their assigned vehicle. Whatever evidence they had collected was now in the hands of people who could act on it. But their relief was short-lived. As the convoy of vehicles pulled away from the bank, Walsh received an urgent radio transmission from one of her surveillance teams. "Deputy Director, we have a problem." The voice crackled through the communication system. "Multiple vehicles with federal plates have been spotted converging on your location. It looks like Kellerman's people have found you." Sarah's stomach dropped as she looked out the rear window of their SUV. Sure enough, she could see dark sedans following them at a distance, maintaining the kind of professional surveillance spacing that suggested law enforcement training. "How did they find us so quickly?" Morrison asked over the radio from his vehicle. "Someone leaked our operational details," Walsh replied grimly, "which means the corruption goes even higher than we thought." The implications were terrifying. If Kellerman had sources inside Walsh's Washington office, then nowhere in the federal system was truly safe. The corrupt network had grown large enough to penetrate even the highest levels of FBI leadership. "What's our contingency plan?" Rodriguez asked, his voice tense despite his weakened condition. Walsh was already coordinating with her driver to change routes and lose their pursuit. But Sarah could see more vehicles joining the chase from side streets and intersections. Kellerman's people had apparently been watching the bank and were now mobilizing every available resource to stop them. "We need to get to the evidence to the media," Sarah said suddenly, "right now before they can stop us." "What do you mean?" Walsh asked. "You said the best way to fight corruption is to expose it to the light," Sarah replied, remembering her earlier conversation with the agents. "If we can get this evidence to journalists before Kellerman's people can silence us, they won't be able to cover it up anymore." Walsh considered the idea as their driver took a sharp turn to avoid a roadblock that was being set up ahead of them. "That's actually not a bad plan," she said. "But we need somewhere secure to examine the evidence and contact the right journalists." "I know a place," Morrison said over the radio. "There's a secure federal facility about 30 miles outside the city. It's used for witness protection and has communication equipment that can't be monitored by anyone. Outside my clearance level. The chase through Denver's streets was like something out of an action movie, except the stakes were real and the consequences of failure could be deadly. Walsh's drivers were skilled at evasive maneuvers, but Kellerman's people seemed to anticipate every move they made. "They're trying to force us toward the highway," one of the drivers reported. "If they can get us into open country, they'll have more options for stopping us." Sarah watched the pursuit unfold with a mixture of terror and fascination. Rex seemed to sense the danger, remaining alert but calm beside her. The German Shepherd had already proven himself invaluable in this operation, and Sarah had a feeling his role wasn't finished yet. As they raced through the outskirts of Denver, Sarah noticed something that the adults had missed. "There's a news helicopter following the chase," she pointed out, gesturing toward the sky. Walsh looked up and smiled for the first time in hours. "That's perfect," she said. "If this is being broadcast live, Kellerman can't risk doing anything too dramatic to stop us. The whole country will be watching." The realization changed the entire dynamic of the chase. Instead of trying to avoid media attention, they now wanted as much publicity as possible. The more witnesses there were to what was happening, the harder it would be for Kellerman to cover up his crimes. "Get me a direct line to that news station," Walsh instructed her communications specialist. "I want to give them a story they'll never forget." As they finally reached the secure federal facility, Sarah realized that what had started as a simple dog walk had become a national news story. The evidence in that metal box would expose corruption at the highest levels of government and restore faith in an institution that millions of Americans depended on for protection. But first, they had to survive long enough to get the truth out to the world. The secure federal facility looked like an ordinary office building from the outside, but Sarah quickly discovered that appearances could be deceiving. Multiple layers of security, bulletproof glass, and communication equipment that could reach anywhere in the world turned the building into a fortress where truth could finally be revealed without fear of interference. Within an hour of their arrival, the metal document box had been opened and its contents spread across a conference table that would have looked at home in the Pentagon. Sarah watched in amazement as Walsh and her team examined hundreds of documents, photographs, and digital storage devices that Morrison and Rodriguez had risked their lives to collect. "This is even more comprehensive than I hoped," Walsh said, holding up a thick folder of bank records. "You've documented financial transactions totaling over $50 million in bribes and kickbacks over the past 18 months. The evidence was staggering in its scope and detail. Morrison and Rodriguez had managed to trace money from major criminal organizations through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts directly into the personal bank accounts of FBI personnel. But the financial records were only the beginning. These photographs are going to destroy Kellerman's career," Rodriguez said, pointing to a series of images that showed the assistant director meeting with known drug cartel representatives at expensive restaurants and private clubs. "We had him under surveillance for 3 months before he discovered our investigation. More damaging still were the audio recordings. Using sophisticated surveillance equipment, the two agents had captured dozens of conversations between corrupt FBI personnel and their criminal contacts. The recordings revealed not just the existence of the corruption network, but detailed information about how it operated and who was involved at every level." Sarah listened to one particularly, damning recording in which Kellerman could be heard giving explicit instructions to sabotage a federal investigation into money laundering. His voice was cold and businesslike as he discussed destroying evidence and intimidating witnesses, as if he were planning an ordinary law enforcement operation rather than obstructing justice. "The most important evidence is this," Morrison said, holding up a small digital drive. "It contains copies of classified FBI files that were sold to criminal organizations. We can prove that specific investigations were compromised because confidential information was leaked to the targets." Walsh immediately understood the implications. "This proves that American lives were put at risk for money," she said. "Undercover agents, confidential informants, witnesses in federal protection, all of them were endangered because corrupt agents sold their secrets to criminals." As they continued examining the evidence, Walsh coordinated with journalists from major news organizations who had been standing by to receive their story. The strategy was to release the information simultaneously to multiple outlets, making it impossible for anyone to suppress or distort the truth. "We're going live in 30 minutes, Walsh announced after finishing a phone call with the producers of a major network news program. "Agent Morrison, Agent Rodriguez, are you prepared to tell your story to the entire country?" Both men nodded grimly. They understood that going public would end their careers in federal law enforcement and potentially put their families at risk. But they also knew that remaining silent would allow the corruption to continue and destroy the institution they had sworn to serve. Sarah found herself included in the media preparations, as her role in discovering and rescuing the agents was crucial to the story's credibility. The idea of appearing on national television was terrifying. But she realized that her testimony would help convince the public that the allegations were genuine rather than part of some political conspiracy. "Just tell the truth," Walsh advised her as they prepared for the broadcast. "Explain how you found them, what condition they were in, and what they told you about why they were left to die. The American people need to hear from someone with no agenda other than doing the right thing." The news broadcast began with the anchor explaining that they had obtained exclusive evidence of widespread corruption within the FBI. The camera then cut to the secure facility where Walsh, Morrison, Rodriguez, and Sarah sat at the conference table surrounded by the evidence that would change everything. Morrison spoke first, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. He explained how the investigation had begun with suspicious patterns in closed cases and had gradually uncovered a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of FBI leadership. "We discovered that Assistant Director Martin Kellerman was personally receiving payments from drug cartels and terrorist organizations in exchange for classified information," Morrison said, looking directly into the camera. But more disturbing than the individual crimes was the systematic nature of the corruption. This wasn't a few bad agents acting alone, but a coordinated effort to turn the FBI into a tool for criminal organizations. Rodriguez, despite his head injury, provided crucial details about how the corruption network operated. He described how criminal organizations had systematically identified and recruited FBI personnel over a period of years, building a network of informants within federal law enforcement. They approached agents who were vulnerable, Rodriguez explained. People with financial problems, family difficulties, or career disappointments. Once they had someone compromised, they used that person to recruit others and gather intelligence about ongoing investigations. When it came time for Sarah to speak, she felt her nervousness disappear as she focused on the simple truth of what had happened. She described finding the agents in the forest, their condition after 3 days of abandonment, and their desperation to expose the corruption before it could destroy more lives. They were willing to die rather than let this continue, Sarah said. Agent Morrison and Agent Rodriguez knew that speaking out would probably end their careers and put their families in danger. But they also knew that staying silent would mean that criminals were controlling part of the FBI. The broadcast continued for an hour, with Walsh presenting key pieces of evidence and explaining their significance. Bank records, photographs, audio recordings, and digital files painted a picture of corruption so extensive that it shocked even experienced journalists. But the most powerful moment came when they played one of the audio recordings in which Kellerman could be heard discussing the decision to eliminate Morrison and Rodriguez. "They're getting too close to the truth," Kellerman's voice said through the speakers. "We need to make them disappear in a way that discredits everything they've discovered. If we can make it look like they went rogue and fled the country, any evidence they collected becomes worthless." The coldness in his voice as he discussed murdering fellow agents sent chills through everyone listening. This wasn't just corruption, it was betrayal of the most fundamental bonds that held law enforcement together. As the broadcast concluded, Sarah realized that they had accomplished something remarkable. In less than 24 hours, they had gone from a desperate hiding in a forest cabin to exposing one of the largest corruption scandals in federal law enforcement history. But the real work was just beginning. Now that the truth was out, the challenge would be rebuilding an institution that had been shaken to its core. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the FBI Academy Auditorium in Quantico, Virginia, watching as Deputy Director Catherine Walsh addressed a graduation ceremony for new agents. The months following their explosive television broadcast had been a whirlwind of congressional hearings, criminal trials, and institutional reforms that had transformed the FBI from top to bottom. The immediate aftermath of their revelations had been swift and decisive. Within hours of the broadcast, Assistant Director Martin Kellerman and 37 other FBI personnel had been arrested on charges ranging from bribery and obstruction of justice to attempted murder. The evidence that Morrison and Rodriguez had risked their lives to collect proved to be even more damaging than anyone had anticipated. Criminal organizations across the country found their operations in chaos as the corrupt agents who had been protecting them were suddenly removed from their positions. Dozens of major investigations that had been sabotaged or abandoned were reopened with honest personnel, leading to hundreds of arrests and the dismantling of networks that had operated with impunity for years. But the real transformation had been cultural. The exposure of such widespread corruption had forced the FBI to confront fundamental questions about how it recruited, trained, and supervised its personnel. New oversight mechanisms, whistleblower protections, and ethics training had been implemented to prevent future corruption from taking root. "The badge we wear represents a sacred trust between law enforcement and the American people," Walsh was saying to the new graduates. That trust was betrayed by individuals who forgot their oath and chose personal gain over public service. But it was restored by agents who were willing to risk everything to preserve the integrity of this institution. Sarah felt a surge of pride as she watched Morrison and Rodriguez, both of whom had been promoted and assigned to the FBI's new Internal Affairs Division. Their courage in exposing the corruption had made them heroes within the Bureau, and their expertise was now being used to prevent future scandals. The legal proceedings had been extensive and highly publicized. Kellerman himself had been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for conspiracy, bribery, attempted murder, and treason. The evidence of his crimes was so overwhelming that he had eventually agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. His cooperation had led to even more arrests and revelations about the scope of criminal infiltration into federal law enforcement. The investigation had expanded to include other agencies and had resulted in the largest law enforcement corruption scandal in American history. For Sarah, the experience had been life-changing in ways she was still discovering. The shy teenager who had simply been walking her dog through the forest had become a national symbol of civic courage. She had testified before Congress, spoken at law enforcement conferences, and received awards from organizations across the country. But perhaps more importantly, the experience had given her a clear sense of purpose. She was now a freshman at Georgetown University, studying criminal justice with plans to join the FBI herself after graduation. The agency that had once seemed hopelessly corrupt now represented everything she wanted to fight for: justice, integrity, and the protection of innocent people. The events of last year reminded us that the greatest threats to law enforcement sometimes come from within, Walsh continued in her address to the graduates. But they also proved that courage and integrity can triumph over corruption when good people are willing to stand up for what's right. Rex, now recognized as an honorary member of the FBI's K-9 unit, sat patiently beside Sarah as she listened to the ceremony. The German Shepherd had become something of a celebrity himself, featured in news stories and even a children's book about his role in exposing the corruption scandal. The transformation within the FBI had been remarkable to witness. New leadership at every level had brought fresh perspectives and renewed commitment to the Bureau's core mission. Morale among honest agents had improved dramatically, as they no longer had to worry about corrupt colleagues sabotaging their work. But the changes went beyond personnel and procedures. The entire culture of the organization had shifted toward greater transparency and accountability. Agents were now encouraged to report suspicious behavior without fear of retaliation, and multiple oversight mechanisms ensured that any allegations of misconduct were thoroughly investigated. I want to close today by recognizing some special guests who remind us why our work matters, Walsh said, gesturing toward the section where Sarah was seated. 6 months ago, a young woman named Sarah Martinez was simply walking her dog when she made a discovery that would change the course of American law enforcement. As the audience turned to look at her, Sarah felt the same mixture of nervousness and determination that had carried her through the most dangerous moments of their ordeal. But now, instead of fear, she felt hope for the future of the institution she was preparing to serve. Sarah Martinez, Agent David Morrison, and Agent Jake Rodriguez demonstrated that the FBI's greatest strength has always been the character of the individuals who choose to serve, Walsh continued. Their courage in the face of overwhelming danger preserved not just their own lives, but the integrity of federal law enforcement itself. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Sarah was most moved by the expressions on the faces of the new graduates. These young men and women were entering the FBI at a time when its reputation had been restored and its mission renewed. They would inherit an organization that had been tested by corruption and emerged stronger because of it. As the ceremony concluded, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that morning when Rex had led her into the forest. The discovery of 2 abandoned FBI agents had set in motion a chain of events that had exposed corruption, removed criminals from positions of authority, and ultimately restored honor to an institution that millions of Americans depended on for protection. The corrupt network that had seemed so powerful and untouchable had crumbled when exposed to the light of truth. Assistant Director Kellerman and his co-conspirators were now serving lengthy prison sentences. Their criminal organizations had been dismantled, and the FBI had implemented reforms that would prevent future corruption from taking root. But perhaps most importantly, the experience had demonstrated that ordinary citizens could make an extraordinary difference when they had the courage to do what was right. Sarah had started as a teenage girl walking her dog, but her willingness to help 2 strangers in distress had ultimately saved an entire institution. As she walked out of the auditorium with Rex beside her, Sarah knew that her own journey was just beginning. The FBI she would join as an agent would be stronger and more honorable because of what they had accomplished together. And somewhere in the mountains of Montana, there was a forest trail where the course of American justice had been changed by a girl and her dog who refused to walk away when they discovered that 2 good men needed help. The badge that Sarah would eventually wear would represent the same sacred trust that Walsh had described to the graduates. But now that trust had been tested and proven, forged stronger by the courage of those who had risked everything to preserve it, the FBI's honor had been lost for a time, but it had been restored by people who understood that integrity was worth any sacrifice.